All right, everybody, I've got 10 o'clock on the dot. I know a few people will still be jumping on, but I wanted to, in interest of our guest time today, go ahead and get us started. Thank you again to everybody who's joined us the last couple of weeks on these ARPA webinar resource um, calls to, keep discussing all of the different ins and outs of the ARPA process. I wanted to reach out. One of the greatest resources that I've had through this process to this point, and a spot where I've definitely kept my ear to the ground is with National League of Cities. They were obviously integral on the head end of this and helping with the legislation and pushing for local government funding, going all the way back to the CARES Act, the original CARES Act, and trying to get that in there. And obviously it took a couple iterations of these federal stimulus programs to finally get that across the finish line, but we're thankful that they did. And so obviously they've been boots on the ground since the get-go on this and are as seasoned as subject matter experts as is possible with this particular subject. So with that, we're lucky to have Mike Wallace, who's from the Federal Legislative Advocacy Team for National League of Cities. I've sat in on a lot of his webinars the last couple months and hearing about the guidance and different things that have come down from Treasury. So feel pretty lucky to have him here. He's going to go over some of the guidance stuff to start, and then is offered to stick around and give us a little bit of time for some Q&A afterwards. So if you've got some questions, obviously I sort of pitched out the homework assignment of reading through that FAQ and starting to get to, as we all try to start to get our minds around where you might be able to invest these dollars to improve your community. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Mike take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Justin. I appreciate the time you've given us here today with your local officials there. I just want to start off by saying how much NLC really appreciates the partnership with your state league, with your elected officials. The only reason we were able to secure these federal dollars is because through the hard work of local elected officials, really educating Congress about the business of local governments. When we first started, the institutional knowledge of what local governments do and the responsibilities and the duties they carry out to residents, the institutional knowledge really wasn't there in a great way on Capitol Hill. And it took a year of just really intensive contact with our federal delegations to get them to understand what cities do, why revenue losses and coronavirus expenditures were harming local budgets, and to get those dollars in the American Rescue Plan Act. I'm going to share my screen now, a few slides to share with everyone. It's going to be a mix of the very basics and some advice from NLC on how to carry these things out. So let's just jump right into it. At the most basic level, NLC with the help of all the state municipal leagues secured $65.1 billion of direct aid to every city, town, and village across the country. That's more than 19,000 units of municipal governments. This is just for municipalities. The counties have their own pot of funds, and so do the states. We worked very hard to make sure that cities, these fundings didn't come with lots of limitations or lots of preemptions or anything like that. We wanted city leaders, local elected officials, really to be the ones who were empowered by these dollars to stabilize their local government operations where necessary, address emergencies, and then help residents and small businesses get back on track and participate and benefit from economic recovery efforts. You'll see here on this slide just links to various different NLC resources that we've made available. We have maybe 100 different blogs and one-pagers right now aimed at specific policy outcomes. No city's grant is big enough to do it all. If you've read through those Treasury rules, you'll know that there's just a tremendous amount of flexibility in what you may do. These grants aren't going to fix every problem, so it's going to be up to municipalities and local leaders to prioritize the areas where they want to make these interventions after they address their emergency needs that are related to COVID. And so depending on where you want to act, we probably have a resource for it. So what is the American Rescue Plan Act? It was signed into law on March 11th, 2021. The state and local fiscal recovery grants are just one piece of the overall package that included funding for EDA, the Economic Development Administration, funding for housing and urban development, and other agencies. And so you may be eligible for some of these other competitive grants that total $1.9 trillion. For the state and local piece, it's $350 billion. And like I said, cities get 65.1 billion and counties get 65.1 billion. For the first time, really, in a long time, perhaps ever, we're in a situation where every unit of government in a region can come together with their own resources to be able to talk about regional growth, regional collaboration, and what residents need. No city should be coming to the table with hat in hand thanks to these grants. Now, they're one-time grants they're going to receive over 2 years, so they're not perpetual. But we really do encourage you to make sure that you're communicating across jurisdictional lines when you're thinking about how to use these dollars to maximum impact. These fiscal grants are not competitive. Every city is entitled to one. Your community is entitled to your dollars. You don't have to demonstrate need or submit a competitive application for it. Justin, let me know that many or the majority of cities in your state have received your ARPA grant dollars, and that's great news. But just because your city is entitled to one doesn't mean it's free money. The grants come with significant requirements. For many of you, those are going to be new requirements and new responsibilities, new compliance and reporting requirements that you may not, if you have not managed a federal grant in the past or managed one in a long time, you may not have maintained that capacity internally, and it will need to either hire to build that capacity back up or rely on outside help, perhaps from the league, perhaps from a consultant or other, or perhaps regionally you can band together to get someone to perform that function. NLC has developed a summary of lots of notable provisions relevant to you and what you're trying to do. And there's a link here in a slide up to the summary provisions. I think my colleague Chris can also put the link in the chat box. Basics to know about this. This is a U.S. Treasury program. So although you can use your dollars for housing in a way HUD, as if it were HUD, you can use your dollars for infrastructure, for broadband, for water and sewer. The Treasury Department is really the only relevant agency when it comes to determining the amount of funding you're getting and setting the rules for how you're allowed to spend. So Treasury is calling the shots on this program. Every local government is a prime recipient. You're not a sub-recipient. You're not getting funds, if Treasury's perspective, sub-allocated. Even though the states are passing through dollars to small cities and towns, you're not a constituent or a subset of the state for this program. You are the prime, every city is the prime recipient and ultimately responsible for the expenditure of its dollars to the extent that they're spending them. Treasury is overseeing the pass-through of ARPA grants to local governments because that's already largely happened in your state. I won't belabor that. The different things I'm going to talk about today, I've drawn from the source material. These documents on the Treasury website, the link is there to the state and local recovery funds. They have an interim final rule, Treasury frequently asked questions, compliance reporting. We're going to provide some advice. NLC can provide some direction, but you really should consult the source documents as well before you make a decision regarding obligation or expenditure. Because like I said, your city is ultimately the one that's going to be responsible for reporting to Treasury, and the one responsible if Treasury determines an expenditure was made outside of the eligible categories. And then that might require a course correction. It could ultimately lead to an attempt to recapture your funds if you go outside the line. So please make sure someone's looking at the source documents. I also want to point out on this slide, we are still operating under an interim final rule, not a completely adopted final rule. What an interim final rule is, it's a rule that the agency proposed that skipped the vetting process that would have normally occurred at the Operations and Management Budget Agency or other White House interests. So it has the force of law, but it's still not final. That means Treasury could still come out with additional spending flexibilities when they do choose to issue the final rule. So if there's things you want to spend your ARPA grant dollars on that you don't think are allowed right now. For instance, one of those things would be deposits into reserve accounts or or other savings accounts. You know, we have submitted comments asking for greater flexibility in that area and several other areas, and it's possible Treasury may make a ruling in our favor. So it's in your interest not to obligate or spend every dollar as soon as you get it. And if you're feeling pressure from your community to spend quickly, of course, put out the fires, but use the fact that the interim final rule has not been finalized as a reason to wait to completely obligate your dollars, and to take your time to think about how you want to obligate your dollars after you address your emergencies. And this is just more reiteration of that. A couple of principles to keep in mind. You don't have to have any dollar obligated until December 31, 2024, and Treasury says dollars must be spent by the end of 2026. Now, we're not saying you should hold on to your dollars into perpetuity or anything like that, but there's a lot of work to do between getting your grant and making that first allocation or obligation, because there are some robust community engagement requirements. There are robust directions encouraging cities to address things other than COVID, for instance, racial inequities or historically disparately impacted populations in your communities. And that's going to take time. That's going to take some data analysis, some stakeholder building, and that's all perfectly good things to do before you obligate your dollars. Cities are not required to make a grant expenditure before the first reporting deadline. We've heard lots of concern from cities that they feel like they have to show or demonstrate an expenditure or progress or something in time to meet that first upcoming reporting deadline. Treasury's told us no. You do need to make a report, but you can report that you have not spent any of your dollars yet. That would be sufficient for this first reporting deadline. And like I said here, what we're advising is address your emergency needs as soon as possible, and then pause, formulate a long-term plan with robust community input, stakeholder engagement for the remainder of your funds, which of course you're going to receive in over 2 years. This is some advice from NLC. This is not from the U.S. Department of Treasury. These are implementation benchmarks that our team at NLC have put together. In addition to the federal advocacy team, we have an Institute on Youth Education of Families who are working on putting together a really broad scale technical assistance program for cities using ARPA. And we've worked with them to develop these benchmarks that we think it'll be helpful to cities that if you haven't managed a federal grant before. So, start with assessing your community needs and make an asset map of existing community resources. We can give you some information on asset mapping. That's essentially looking at educational institutions, citizen groups, major employers. You have to look at your needs and your assets in order to figure out how to use your dollars most effectively. Review the Treasury guidance and our resources, and then host stakeholder meetings to get your community's input. There's nothing wrong with moving quickly either, but what we're seeing from across the country is cities that have moved to obligate the majority of their dollars very quickly, within days or weeks of receiving them. There's been considerable community pushback because community members, have been watching also the American Rescue Plan Act. The local grants are just one piece of that, but I would say the community has a high level of anticipation around these grants, and they want to, at least your activist community wants to be part of that. Also, communicate with overlapping and neighboring jurisdictions to get the regional point of view. Your residents may be, I don't know if it's so much true in your state because you're a little bit more spread out than the folks here in the Northeast, but to the extent that the housing market's regional, job markets are regional, residents are traveling between jurisdictions from the city to unincorporated areas in the county, that sort of thing. You want to be making sure you know what your county is prioritizing, what your state is prioritizing, and then you're not duplicating funds for residents on things that other jurisdictions might already be taking care of, and you can direct your resources to those things that aren't being taken care of already by others. The recent Treasury FAQ actually relaxed flexibility in terms of who you can transfer your dollars to. We knew that if you simply don't want your grants, that it's not large enough to deal with the compliance reporting, you can send it to your state and be done with it. A recent FAQ made it clear that cities may transfer dollars to other cities or to counties or to the state, not to get rid of it, but it's sort of like a sub-grantee. So if you want to increase the uptake of vaccinations in your community, and your county public health department already has a program for that, you can send dollars to your county public health department to include targeted efforts for your residents, for instance. The county can send dollars to the city if the county wants to make an impact on affordable housing, for instance. So, and everyone can send dollars to a council of government or a metropolitan planning organization. Now, sharing dollars that way does not excuse you from being responsible for those dollars. You still have to make sure whoever you're sending dollars to is using those dollars in line with the eligible expenditures. But that's a great flexibility that you may want to take advantage of. Propose a recovery plan there at number 6, and then publicize that plan for community feedback. That's a requirement under the bill. Implement the plan and track your expenditures, because you never know when Treasury is going to ask for an accounting of how you spent. Now, as a practical matter, there's no way Treasury can take a direct look at 19,000 plus grantees in 1 year. But that doesn't mean that 10 years down the line, an inspector general from Treasury isn't going to become interested in an expenditure, or a resident may raise an objection and send that to Treasury or something like that. So you want to make sure you have a plan for recording and documenting and holding on to those documents for the long term, in case the federal government comes to you and says they just want to have an accounting or audit of how you spent. And then lastly, build in opportunities to reassess, amend, and pivot plans in case of unanticipated needs, unforeseen setbacks, or weak outcomes. I tell you, when we first started putting together guidance for cities on these, we were not thinking about a Delta variant. We were not thinking that there was going to be a setback imminent, yet here we are. We don't know exactly what it means, but it could make sense to hold some dollars in reserve just in case an outbreak happens in your community and you need access to greater protective gear, or need to help with your healthcare providers or that sort of thing. Similarly, in weak outcomes, you may have a nonprofit partner who you're working with who has a very good plan, and it looks like it's going to work, but for whatever reason it doesn't. You want to be able to make sure that you've regularly built in opportunities to reassess and reassess, and don't be afraid to change tactics if something just isn't working out. So how does my city receive funds? You probably already know this. You receive them over 2 years. So most of you have already received the first half of your dollars. The second half of your grant dollars will come to you 12 months after you received the first half. Every city falls in one of 2 buckets: the metropolitan city or the non-entitlement unit. For the most of you will be non-entitlement units. What the difference is a metropolitan city is a city with more than 50,000 residents, and that's how the bill defines it, or a small handful of cities under 50,000 that are still nonetheless the largest metro in their region. Non-entitlements are under 50,000. And the Congress presumes the non-entitlements have fewer staff, therefore non-entitlements have less overhead compared to the larger metro areas. Let's see here, and I won't belabor that because I know most of you already have funds in hand. A couple definitions here. We get these questions, what constitutes a project, because big projects have lots of different pieces. Treasury's provided this definition here: the series of closely related activities drawn toward a common purpose. So for instance, if you have a sewer project and you have to crack the street to get to it, it would be perfectly reasonable to spend your dollars to repair that street after you're done with the project, even though surface transportation is not an eligible use. But then you couldn't go and use your ARPA dollars to make more kinds of substantive upgrades to your street, because technically surface transportation isn't there. So it's all related toward a common purpose, getting to the pipes, for instance, and replacing lead or whatever, replacing aging infrastructure underground. What if my project isn't listed as an example on the eligible expenditures? So the Treasury guidance provides dozens and dozens of specific examples of what is an eligible expenditure, but they're very clear to say those aren't exhaustive lists. As long as your project adheres to the letter of the bill language, it is an eligible expenditure. Treasury's also told us they don't have enough staff, or they're not in a position to make a ruling on every single city's expenditure. So what they've done is created a framework for cities to work through to see if their project qualifies. If it's not already listed as an eligible expenditure, there has to be some nexus to COVID-related harm. You have to identify the harmful effect of COVID-19 that will be addressed by your project. you're going to have to figure out a way to display evidence and document and show that there is a causal or compounding connection between the COVID-19 harm, between COVID-19 and whatever you're trying to address, and then determine how to prove that what your project's going to do is going to provide an outcome that addresses that COVID-related harm. And then number 3 there, Treasury has carved out a special category for addressing disproportionate impact on distressed communities, sectors, populations. If your expenditure is targeted toward targeted toward distressed sectors or communities, that will make a better case for that expenditure for you as an eligible expenditure under this program. But just remember, you're going to have to document the connection in your reporting, send that to Treasury, and make the case. Treasury's identified 7 broad categories of spending that's eligible under the program, and 66 subcategories under those 7. The 7 broad categories are responding to public health concerns raised by the pandemic, responding to negative economic impacts of the pandemic, services to disproportionately impacted communities. That's kind of a new one that was not in the original text, but Treasury has created incentives to spend in that way. Providing premium pay to essential workers, both public workers, workers on the public payroll, and private sector workers. Improving water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Replacing lost revenue, which was the really original reason why we were seeking these dollars. And for administrative costs. What you cannot use your dollars for is premium pay for telework. So for premium pay, it has to be for workers whose jobs require them to interact with the public, to be on the front lines, in other words. If you have employees who do not regularly interact with the public, who are teleworkers, they do not qualify for premium pay. You can't deposit these dollars directly into pension funds or any day funds, financial reserves, or outstanding debt. As I mentioned earlier, we've asked for some flexibility in that regard. And I would encourage you to wait to see the final rule to see if we get that flexibility if you're interested in making that kind of support. But as of right now, you cannot do it. You cannot use these dollars for federal match requirements if the match is specifically prohibited by the other fund. This is a little bit complicated, but essentially if you have another federal grant for a different project and you want to combine your state and local recovery grant with those funds, if that other grant says there's a local match requirement and you can't use federal funds to make that match, then you can't use your ARPA dollars for that. If that other program does permit you to allow federal funds as a federal match, use federal funds as your local match, then you can use your ARPA funds. So instead of looking at the ARPA rules, look at the other grant program to determine whether you can use your local funds for a match or not. And then you can't use these funds for anything that falls out of the 7 spending categories there. If you want to get an idea of how some other cities are using their funds, we do have a local action tracker. You can search it by city size, you can search it by policy priority, and get some ideas of what's happening across the nation. I'm going to go quickly through the different categories of eligible use. This is for the public health. Certainly, you can use your dollars to increase vaccination rates, to get people there, to address, to help residents who have been infected by COVID, to overcome them, to help offset medical costs, anything related to COVID broadly. I saw just yesterday, actually, the White House specifically made direct payments to individuals as compensation for getting a vaccine an eligible use. And the White House was saying, you know, paying a resident up to $100 for a vaccine is eligible with your ARPA grant dollars. I should say here about your reporting requirements, you'll hear this a couple of times. All projects got to have a nexus to COVID-19 related harm. So it's not enough just to funnel dollars into existing health programs that may have been present before coronavirus. You do have to show that there is a nexus to COVID related harm. On the economic impacts, this is another very broad and flexible category. The only limitation really in helping reduce or address economic harm related to COVID is that you do have to show whatever harm you're addressing was made worse or was caused by measures to contain COVID. So, examples here would be financial aid programs to help residents with food, housing, utilities, childcare, debt forgiveness. I think many of these are activities that small cities in particular, the bill really contemplates cities intervening in the fiscal decline and the personal fiscal decline of residents. And I don't think that's an activity that lots of cities necessarily have been performing regularly. I know cities really do snap into action, but with the loss of a major employer, for instance, or something other sort of community-wide event. But this bill really allows cities, if a resident can't make their rent, if they can't provide food for their family, if they don't have access to other federal benefits or experience sort of an emergency setbacks, local governments can use these dollars to intervene and aid those residents so that they don't become homeless, for instance, or that their kids can continue to get to school and that sort of thing. You can use these dollars for a loan or grant program to small businesses or nonprofit organizations. The bill really, or the rules really treat nonprofits and businesses the same. So you can provide grants that don't require repayment. You can provide loans that do. You can generate program income with a loan program with your grant dollars, and you can use the interest earned off of those loans, the program income. If you do generate program income, you have to spend those dollars in accordance with the rules under the Treasury until the end of 2026. At the end of 2026, if you have program income remaining, you can spend that however you like. You can rehire public sector staff or laid off or furloughed workers. We really think that that would be sort of the emergency kind of expenditure you should be making immediately. You can also use these dollars to improve your data collection, data analysis, getting different data systems to talk to one another. That's some of whenever we do technical assistance, cities always want help in that area, but there's rarely money left over in the budget to really tackle that because you're dealing with so many other things. If you do want to improve the way your city uses data to make budget choices and other kinds of decisions, you can use these dollars to improve those systems or bring people on board to help you do that. And then lastly, we know many cities are contemplating some kind of piloting some universal basic income programs, and you can do that with these dollars. The Treasury has created an incentive for cities to spend to address disproportionately impacted communities. Basically what they say are, if you have a qualified census tract in your city, a qualified census tract is simply a census tract with a high degree of poverty or low wage workers in it. Then you can spend in those qualified census tracts, and you do not have to provide additional documentation about your expenditures to Treasury if you're spending within a qualified census tract. It doesn't release you from the rules around how you can spend, but Treasury won't require additional documentation. So if your city is really worried about the cost of compliance and overhead on this program, if you have a qualified census tract and you do your spending in that census tract, that will release you some of that. The same protection or the same incentive for qualified census tracts, if you have a neighborhood that's been historically disparately impacted, even if it's not in a qualified census tract, but you can identify a neighborhood or a zip code where things like life expectancy is smaller or access to credit is smaller, that sort of thing, then you can spend your dollars in a way that targets the outcome to those communities. Then you'll get the same benefit. You don't have to provide additional documentation to Treasury, as long as you can show that data that shows the communities you're helping have been disparately impacted. We already talked a lot about premium pay and who's eligible for it. I'll just say, it's when it comes to city workers, that's going to be a lot easier for you if you want to spend in this way, because you could just add it to payroll. But you can also send dollars directly to business owners to supplement the income, supplement the wages of their frontline workers. So grocery store workers, for instance, or if you have any kind of private maintenance or any, whoever you're contracting with, if they have workers whose jobs requires them to daily interact with the public, you can supplement their wages up to $13 an hour. And then revenue replacement, you know, there is a great calculator at the GFOA website. That's the Government Finance Officers Association. It's a kind of a complicated calculation Treasury is given to cities to determine their revenue loss. But GFOA has created an online calculator that makes it very simple to enter in some numbers you should already know from your budget, and they'll calculate what Treasury says you can consider revenue replacement. The reason you want to make that calculation is revenue replacement is the most flexible spending category, because essentially once you've made your calculation, you can take that amount of dollars and treat them as if they were general fund dollars. So the prohibitions and limitations in the other expenditure categories, those fall off when it comes to revenue replacement dollars. The only limitations that remain is that you cannot spend in a way that's specifically prohibited. So you can't deposit into rainy day funds, you can't pay down existing debt, that sort of thing. But other than that, you know, if you have a general fund line item for potholes and street repair, you can use your ARPA dollars for that to the extent those ARPA dollars are part of your revenue replacement category of funds. And then lastly, water, sewer, and infrastructure. I'm not NLC's expert on these issues, but just pointing out broadly, within water and sewer infrastructure, there's lots of flexibilities. But outside of those three infrastructure categories, you cannot spend on other types of infrastructure unless it's incidentally related to the project at hand. The other thing to know is that if you that ARPA dollars do not trigger Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements. So if you have a project that is wholly funded with ARPA dollars, you do not have to meet Davis-Bacon wage requirements. However, if you're blending federal dollars, for instance, if you get a community development block grant, funding from the community development block grant, which does require Davis-Bacon wages, and you use your CDBG dollars and your ARPA dollars on the same project, ARPA is not going to get you out of that requirement. If you use those two programs together, that means for the entire project, in terms of federal dollars, you have to be paying Davis-Bacon wages. Just some examples here of the different kinds of things that you can use with these dollars: lead service line replacement, improving water treatment systems facilities, or connecting residents to central systems, improving stormwater flood control, modernizing of cybersecurity. This is an important one. Recently, we've seen so many cyber attacks on infrastructure. You may use these dollars to upgrade your security of your systems, and to provide reliable broadband services to those who do not have it currently. Lastly, the administrative costs. I'm glad this is in here. It wasn't in the bill. Treasury recognizes, particularly for cities that do not manage federal grants regularly, that there's going to be a lot to do up front. You're going to have to develop a set of internal controls for sub-grantees, for documenting and maintaining compliance with everything. It's a lot of work. Treasury says you can use your grant dollars themselves to pay for all of the compliance and regulatory requirements that are required under your grant. The way NLC sort of sees this is, the best possible way to do this would be try to increase capacity internally. So either hiring new staff or sending existing staff to trainings to get them to the kind of information, the kind of trainings and skill they need to make sure that your city can comply with the federal requirements. But if you don't want to do that, certainly you can call in consultants or outside help to get one-time outside help on these dollars if you don't anticipate applying for federal funds in the future. I think I've already went over most of these sort of things here. You have an expenditure deadline. Funds can be put into an interest-bearing account, and you can collect that interest. In terms of setting aside dollars, you should be prepared you should be prepared for an audit, either being triggered by the size of your grant or potentially a request from the federal agency asking to see how you spent your dollars. So setting aside some amount of dollars for meeting audit requirements is probably a good idea. Oh, I think I went back on accident here. And I'm close to wrapping up here. You'll see here there's deadlines for different types of cities. For most of you, as non-entitlement units, your first report's going to be due by the end of October, October 31st. Let's see. Yeah, that's right. So I think your initial, again, I'm stumbling here. The initial report looks like it's due September 31st, 2021, and then the deadline for the annual deadline after that will be October 31st, 2021. But like I said, for small cities, it doesn't have to be a ridiculously long report. If you haven't spent your dollars, it could be a very short report by that time. But Treasury really just wants to make sure that you're able to get into the reporting system, that you're registered with your DUNS number, that you have all the administrative things taken care of, so that then they can move on to helping cities with the actual expenditures of dollars. In terms of reporting and compliance, there's a lot to know. And NLC, you know, can help you in that regard, but you should really go to the source at Treasury. They have recorded webinars for small cities, for large cities with lesser funds, and large cities with greater funds. Each one has its own specific webinar. It can really walk you through, open your eyes to what's required under the bill, under the rule, that is. And again, these are just the source documents. In terms of NLC resources, we have dozens and dozens of things. This is just a small example. If your city wants to prioritize economic mobility, housing stability, clean water, food access, you know, anything like that, you know, you can find a resource at NLC. And this is just a little commercial about what we offer. And of course, Kirk, I think, who's on with us, is your city's contact at NLC. And with that, I'll wrap it up here. I think I'm just about 5 minutes over my time, Justin, but happy to take any questions or conversation.
Hey, Mike, real quick, before we open, or before we get some questions coming in from the floor, on those, I've been watching on the Treasury website. I know that we've heard discussion that they were going to do an NEU webinar at some point. I haven't seen that yet. Have we heard any more about when that might be coming?
Yeah, let me double check on that for you. I know that they do have an NEU webinar in the works. I think, you know, there's still some value in viewing the existing webinars, just in terms of what you know, what internal controls that they're looking for cities to have. But yeah, as soon as they get that on the books, we'll run that back up the flag for them.
Okay. If anybody's got questions for Mike, feel free to go ahead and unmute or post them in the chat, either way.
Mike, this is Mia Harris with the City of Riverton.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to confirm that I heard correctly that we are able to transfer our ARPA dollars into an interest-bearing account, and the interest then is not reportable, but and the cities get to collect that. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep. Yeah. You just have to make sure your funds are obligated by 2024. So putting your funds in an interest-bearing account wouldn't be considered an expenditure. You can sort of park them there, but you can't park them indefinitely, right? You still have to make sure that they're obligated by 2024 to some other purpose and then spent by 2026.
Okay, thank you.
And we've kind of given the guidance on that too, Mike. Obviously, in Wyoming anyway, the rules on how our municipalities are able to invest their, you know, basically their reserve funds and those kinds of things are fairly strict,
Mm-hmm.
very low risk. So obviously with these, we've preached that we stay on the very low risk end, low risk but low reward. But
Yeah,
you know, to be sure that something, you don't end up in some sort of pitfall.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, these funds are so flexible that you know, and I said you can't do everything with them. So you do sort of have to do a risk assessment about you know, spending in the low risk ways that you know are correct, or addressing sort of bigger issues in your community, you know, but maybe I wouldn't say riskier, but you know, further afield than what your city typically performs in a year.
Hey, Mike, this is Kelly with the town of Jackson. You mentioned potholes and maintenance of infrastructure. With new infrastructure, it specifically says maintenance of a sidewalk. Would a new sidewalk qualify as well?
For your revenue replacement dollars, yes. So once you make your revenue replacement calculation, you can treat those dollars essentially like they're just general fund dollars, and so you could spend up to the amount that you've calculated for revenue replacement on new sidewalks, for instance, or other you know, items that you normally have in your budget.
Thank you. And then a second question on the revenue calculation. We have, you know, specific purpose taxes for a capital project, and they just started coming in during the 18-month period, but they are not for general government uses. So we couldn't find language. I've talked with a couple folks here. Would you exclude that from the revenue calculation because it is going to one specific road project?
So this is what Treasury has to say. So we've asked for clarification on that issue, and hopefully we'll see clarification in the final rule. But Treasury has provided, Treasury recognizes there's all kinds of these different revenue sources and different ways to raise revenue state by state. And so what Treasury says essentially is that there's some flexibility here, but if you're, you know, in terms of your revenue replacement calculation, it has to be consistent amongst all the cities in your state, right? So your state here may be able to help clarify this for you too. If Treasury won't clarify whether you should include that in your calculation, it would fall to the state to make that determination and keep cities sort of aligned in the same ways. What Treasury doesn't want to see is one city counting it and another city not counting it within the same state. They want to see some consistency across the cities in the state. So, so I would say, you know, in the short term, that's a good question. Chris, if you could put the Treasury email for questions and concerns in the chat. One thing you can do is send that question directly to Treasury and CC advocacy@nlc.org, and they should be able to get to your question. But also, you know, it would be a good idea just to know how other cities are treating you across the state, and if you, as you know, as all the cities in the state, if you can sort of come to consensus on how that ought to be treated, there's a good chance Treasury will just accept that that's the way it's being done.
Is that something in other states, Mike, that's, I mean, is that something that the state governments are coordinating that you've seen to this point, or? Yeah,
it just depends on if there are, it depends on what the unique issues are to each state, you know. So some states are much more strict about the kinds of revenue cities are allowed to raise. Other states take a hands-off approach, and cities have found lots of different creative ways to raise revenue, but Treasury can't contemplate all of that, right? And so I think in some places where, you know, where there's a state rule governing that kind of revenue, the state does take an active hand. You know, otherwise, you know, it could be something the league does, or some, you know, another fiscal association or that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, in the tax that Kelly's mentioning, the specific purpose tax, so we're one of those states that falls on the very restrictive end of the spectrum as far as what our, you know, what our self-taxing powers are outside of the state government. But we do have the ability to go to the voters to ask for 2 optional sales tax pennies, but the second one of those is what's considered a specific purpose tax. So we have to propose a specific project.
Right.
Once that project's paid for, the tax sunsets. But like Kelly said, that doesn't go into the pot for general government operations.
Yeah. In our comments to Treasury, we've said the same, is that special use taxes, special fees, or these one-off kinds of votes, like that cities should have the option not to include those in their revenue calculations. I think the fact that the funds are not intended for to support the general fund of the budget is a good argument for the fact that if you don't want to calculate it, that's a good argument to Treasury that you shouldn't have to calculate it. But hopefully the final rule or an updated FAQ will provide greater clarity to us.
You bet. Any other questions from the group? All right, Mike, I don't see anything else in the chat. Thank you guys so much, you and Chris and Kirk, for joining us today from National League. If you guys have not gone to the National League website and looked at their ARPA resources, they've got is fleshed out and as good a list of resources there as possible, and it's expanding all the time. As Kirk posted in the chat too, obviously WAM maintains our National League membership, but it is a membership driven organization. So they would obviously appreciate the consideration if you're not an NLC member when you take advantage of those resources. And if you think it's worth a look as far as membership goes, I know that we would appreciate that as well. So but again, with that, thanks. Thank you so much again for tuning in. For next Friday, I am working with the County Commissioners Association to try and line up some representatives from the association as well as some county commissioners to come talk. Obviously, that was some of the discussion we've had up to this point, and the counties did see the lion's share of this funding when it came to the local government, total pot. They actually saw the majority of it, and we are looking for ways to collaborate with them. And as Mike mentioned, the ability for some of those funds to be able to be moved around from government to government if there's opportunities to collaborate on bigger projects or crossover projects, and how to kind of approach those conversations is what I'm really hoping to get at for next Friday. So we'll get that link out as soon as we can so everybody can take a look at that. And with this, of course, we'll go ahead and get this recording uploaded. Mike, if you could you forward me your presentation? That way folks can have access to links and everything. So I'll attach that just like we did last week. So
yeah, I'll happy to do that. And NLC, we really want you to be able to spend confidently, and not be over anxious or over worried about whether you're doing the right thing, or, say as long as your aim is true, right, and you're trying to make a positive intervention and positive impact on your community, don't be hesitant to reach out directly to NLC. If Treasury won't give you an answer on a project, maybe we can help. But anything we can do to help you be confident in your use of these grants, we're here for you. So thank you, Justin.
Thanks so much, Mike. We appreciate it again. Thank you to everybody for attending, and everybody have a great, safe weekend. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.